Brochs, the mysterious circular symbols of Scotland. Hundreds of these ancient stone structures dot the Scottish Highlands, but the true purpose of brochs continues to baffle experts. Travel north through Scotland's deep glens, its mist and mountains and its velvety moorland, and you'll eventually see them, crumbling stone towers rising against the Highland peaks like ancient cragtop castles. These mysterious Iron Age monuments are known as brochs, and they exist nowhere else but here. Yet, while these circular drywalled structures are as symbolic a feature as any in the Scottish Highlands, their purpose remains unknown. What is known is that around 2,000 years ago, local tribes started harvesting local stone to build massive prehistoric buildings with walls 5 m thick and stretching 13 m high. To date, anywhere from 100 to 500 broch sites have been identified, with the densest concentration centered in Scotland's northern Caithness and Sutherland counties, as well as the Northern Isles. While early archaeologists thought that brochs, whose name derives from the lowland Scottish word for fort, were the citadels of local chieftains, more recent excavations suggest that the structures were more likely used for residential rather than defensive purposes. Now, in an effort to better understand the true purpose of these prehistoric towers, an ambitious initiative called the Caithness Broch Project is aiming to reconstruct a full-scale broch from scratch using traditional methods. By relying on archaeological evidence from broch sites and incorporating the same dry stone masonry techniques Iron Age tribes would have used, builders are aiming to understand whether the organization of Iron Age Highland societies revolved around brochs or whether brochs evolved to fit the shifting needs of Highland societies. What's more, by creating a modern attraction modeled on a historical blueprint, architects are hoping that visitors will gain a newfound appreciation for these iconic buildings that have long shaped the Scottish landscape. The mystery of France's Stonehenge. Built 1,000 years before the famed English site, the alignments de Carnac's 3,000 perfectly aligned stones continue to baffle historians. Not far from the wide, sun-drenched beaches of Carnac in France's northwestern Brittany region, I stood and looked out at the endless rows of standing stones that make up the alignments de Carnac alignments. The tall, roughly hewn stones were divided into symmetrical, evenly spaced columns that disappeared into the distance, and I could see how the local legend of St. Cornely had arisen. Supposedly, St. Cornely, the patron saint of cattle, pursued by a legion of Roman soldiers and finding no other means of escape, had hidden in the ear of an ox and turned the legionnaires to stone. Needless to say, this isn't the true origin of the alignments. Aside from the unlikely transfiguration, the standing stones predate the Roman Empire by at least 3,000 years. But in a superstitious time, this was probably a plausible explanation for a mystery that baffles experts to this day. Stretching 4 kilometers along the coast of Brittany and consisting of more than 3,000 menhirs, man-made, often tapered, stones erected in prehistoric times across Western Europe, not unlike those obelisk from the Asterix comics made a career sculpting and delivering, the Carnac alignments represent the largest group of man-made standing stones in the world. Like Stonehenge, their purpose, what they represent and who placed them are mysteries shrouded in theory and legend. Yet, their place as one of the most important sites of European prehistory is undisputed. Radiocarbon dating has determined that the granite menhirs were erected by a Neolithic community around 6,000 years ago, about 1,000 years before Stonehenge. The stones range in size from 0.5 m tall to the hulking giant of Mainio, which soars 6 m, with an average-sized menhir weighing between 5 and 10 tons. They were generally quarried from the bedrock that lies close to the surface of the site and hauled and erected using pulleys and brute strength. Given the superhuman effort needed to create them, the alignments would have held enormous significance, but the site's administrator, Olivier Agag, believes that true purpose of the alignments will likely remain unknown. There are plenty of interesting theories, some with examples that seem to fit in certain circumstances, but there's always more to disprove them than to prove them, he told me. The Carnac alignments are not straight, they meander and follow a ridge that separates the coastal plain from the interior, land-based world, likely acting as a kind of symbolic border between the two. Of course, it did not prevent people from passing between them, but it marks a geographical separation between land and sea that isn't random. Kneeling next to a menhir with serpentine carvings at its base that sparked its own set of theories, he added, but its ceremonial or religious significance is open to interpretation. Given this open pool of conjecture, it's unsurprising that myths and legends swept in to fill the void. Stories of goblin-like creatures called korrigans, or of stone soldiers going to drink from a stream on Christmas Eve and crushing anyone in their path may sound like dark fairy tales, but these early attempts to explain the unknown created a sense of awe that has helped preserve the site. The idea of menhirs representing soldiers extends to Celtic heroes defeated on the battlefield, explained Wendy Muse, the author of many books about the landscape, history and legends of Brittany. She added that parallels between the legend of Saint Cornley and long-standing Breton mythology still resonate today. Not far away in Quiberon, a menhir has been used for the modern war memorial. The Carnac alignments are made up of several distinct sections of standing stones, now divided by land, trees or roads, although there are theories they were once unbroken. The most famous of these sections are called Lilmennick, Kermario and Curliscan, which are also the best preserved examples of these long lines of menhirs. However, there are also a number of dolmen, stone burial chambers, some of which predate the menhirs and combine to make this an extraordinarily dense megalithic site. The area covered by the Carnac alignments is too big to truly appreciate from ground level. To gain a greater perspective, Agog took me to another of the area's most interesting features, roughly 1.5 kilometers from the rows of stones. The Saint Michel tumulus, a huge, grass-covered mound that looms over Carnac, is the largest grave mound in continental Europe, built roughly 6,700 years ago. We walked through the dark, cramped passages and chambers within the tumulus itself, which are currently closed to the public, and Agog pointed out where valuable relics, including polished stone axes and items originating from Italy and Spain, were found. Due to the corrosive acidity of the soil, very few artifacts have been found at Carnac outside burial tombs. Standing on top of the tumulus, the countryside fanned out into the distance and the huge scale of the alignments, one of the world's largest Neolithic monuments, became clear. Covering an area of 40 hectares, the fields of stones stretched further than I could see. It seemed unbelievable that thousands of menhirs weighing several tons each were quarried, moved and erected in an age when stone tools were the height of technology. Walking back through the menhirs, Agog explained while the alignments are reasonably well preserved, both nature and humans have altered the appearance of the site over time. When the alignments were constructed, the landscape would have been open, without the trees that now divide and flank the sections, and the sea would have been further away. And in the past 6,000 years, some of the menhirs have toppled over, including one last year. Humans have altered the site in other ways. As we moved between the stones, Agog pointed to 3 deep gashes in one of the mammoth menhirs, indicating cuts made with modern tools, and explained that they have been used as local building materials, including, supposedly, in the construction of the lighthouse on the nearby island of Belle Isle. The changes to the stones and site isn't just a modern phenomenon. It's a place of life, Agog said, as the site has been constantly evolving. Some of the later Neolithic dolmens were even built using stones placed hundreds of years before in other parts of the alignments. With roads that now snake between the fields and the buildings that stand among them, the site's original architects might struggle to recognize their creation if they saw it today. The first serious excavations at Carnac took place in the 1870s by Scottish archaeologist James Milne, who recorded the positions and details of the menhirs and also discovered many artifacts inside the dolmen. Milne's work was continued by his apprentice, Zachary Le Ruzic, who began to restore the stones, re-erecting and marking those that had fallen. Milne and Le Ruzic's efforts laid the groundwork for the alignments to be recognized and protected by the state, but with this recognition came increased popularity. Because of their historical significance and breathtaking scale, the alignments have attracted tourists for hundreds of years. However, as visitor numbers swelled in the 20th century to levels that threatened to damage the site, a project aimed at restricting public access was initiated in 1990 to provide educational resources and safeguard the stones. Because of concerns about conservation, free access to the stones is only allowed in winter. However, not everyone agrees that this is the right approach for the future of the site. The Menhirs Libres, Free Menhirs, is a Karnak-based group that states they advocate for the wishes of the local residents. Concerned about the commercialization of the site and the implications more visitors may have, a spokesperson said, the campaigns to attract visitors focus on the dream, the mystery, the beauty of the site without visitors at sunrise or sunset. The photos and videos never show the reality of overcrowding in summer with traffic jams on the roads and cars parking anywhere possible. The group believes that with better organization, the flow of tourists could be managed between the different sections of the alignments to avoid high concentrations in particular areas. Regardless of the site's future management, the alignments stand as a monument to human inspiration and ability. With technology now at our fingertips, there are few things that can't be found with our phones. But here, on this stretch of remote French coastline, it's refreshing to be presented with a genuine mystery that has persevered for millennia. The royal roots of Quebec's French. Quebecois French has long been mocked for its rough-and-tumble sound, but this version of French is more likely what 17th-century French aristocracy spoke, including the king. It was a perfect sun-splashed summer afternoon as my mother and I meandered through Quebec City's old town, stopping at Place Royale, a 400-year-old cobblestone square of historical greystone buildings with dormer windows and pitched roofs in red, copper and slate. My mother was born and raised in this French-speaking city, so I knew that now, at 80, it meant a lot to her to be back for a visit. As we reminisced, the sound of the local accent floated around us, and I thought about something I'd recently heard, that while the French spoken in Quebec may not ring as romantic or mellifluous to the ear as contemporary Parisian French, now considered the gold standard, the way the Quebecois speak is actually closer in pronunciation to the French used by 17th-century aristocrats, and even the king. I grew up in Montreal in the 1960s and 70s, when Anglophones, along with the French from France, mocked the rough-and-tumble pronunciation of Quebec French, comparing it to the quacking of ducks. I myself was always deeply embarrassed in the company of my Anglophone classmates at French immersion school. So-called pundits and my teachers, who hailed from France and Morocco, said that the relaxed Quebec pronunciation was disgraceful, that it made a mockery of the language of Molière. As it turns out, the celebrated 17th-century playwright likely sounded more like a modern-day Quebecois, rather than a contemporary Parisian, than they knew. I'd actually balked when someone told me this a few weeks earlier over lunch at a café in North Hatley, a quaint village in the gently mountainous eastern townships, southeast of Montreal. I'd known that Quebecois French had retained many vestiges of Le Français du Roi or the King's French, especially in its vocabulary, but I drew the line at pronunciation. There's no way that Louis XIV said, pas, voilà, or to et mot. I'd said incredulously, as I compared those to the more commonly accepted pronunciations of pas, voilà, and toi et moi. But there are logical linguistic and historical reasons why Quebecois French is different from French French, what linguists call normative or neutralized French. There is one thing that characterizes Quebecois French and that is its rhythm, said Chantal Bouchard, a sociolinguist in the French department at Montreal's McGill University and author of Méchante langue, la légitimité linguistique du français par le Québec, wicked language, the linguistic legitimacy of the French spoken in Quebec. We in Quebec have conserved something from 17th-century French, the distinction between the long vowels and the short vowels. She gave the example of the ai/e vowel. If one says vous faites, you do/make, the Quebecois vowel is short, as in get, but if one says la fête, the party, the vowel is long, as in hey. The French have not conserved this short/long vowel difference, she explained. They still spell fêtes and fête differently, but they pronounce them both the same way. Claude Poirier, a historian of Quebec French at the Université Laval in Quebec City, has spent a lot of time poring over 17th-century archival documents to determine if the spelling of certain words could give us an idea of their pronunciation. He found that in the 1658 Courdax, a lawyer who came to Quebec from Poitou in west-central France spelled perdre, lose, as pardre, which is closer to how some people in Quebec still pronounce the word. Another example he found was the word devoir, must or to be obligated to. It was spelled devour, he said, and was pronounced devoir, the way many elderly Quebecois still pronounce it today. Another major difference is vocabulary. Words like char for car, pièce, slang $4, dispendier for expensive, patate for potato, and bar for locked instead of the normative French for ma clef, closed with a key, all originate from a more antiquated French no longer used in France. So how is that Quebec's version retained more 17th-century aristocratic relics than what's spoken in Paris, the accepted seat of the French language? Both Bouchard and Poirier noted that 16th and 17th-century French settlers who immigrated to Quebec, then known as New France, tended to be natives of northern and western France. Aside from royalty and the aristocracy, only 1/3 of the people in France spoke French at that time. The rest spoke their regional languages, such as Breton, Provençal or Norman. In New France, however, concerted efforts were made to teach the new arrivals French, and it was the version spoken at the royal court by the aristocrats of the north and west. Thus, aristocratic French became generalized among the settlers. In the mid-1700s, French explorer Louis-Antoine de Bougainville even wrote that the Canadian accent is as pure as that of the Parisians. But everything began to change in 1759 when France lost its colony to the British at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in Quebec City. Contact between France and New France was ruptured, and with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763, a good part of the elite returned to Europe. More dramatic changes came with the French Revolution, cutting off the mother country from its former colony for another 4 decades. It seems more like old France lives on in Canada, and that it is our country, France, which is the new one. According to Poirier, during this period of alienation, scholars in France embarked on a massive effort to spread the use of French and standardize its grammar and pronunciation. The bourgeoisie dumped all the pronunciations they didn't deem perfect, and they continued their purification through the 18th century, he said. In short, French in France changed, while in Quebec it stayed more or less the same. The Québécois are conservatives, said Poirier. They conserved the French language as it was spoken in the Ancien Régime. By the time the French began traveling to Quebec again, then known as Lower Canada, around 1830, the differences had become extreme. When famous French thinker Alexis de Tocqueville visited in 1831, he wrote in a letter to his mother, "Canada raises our curiosity. The French nation has been preserved there." As a result, one can observe the customs and the language spoken during Louis XIV's reign. And in another letter, he admitted, "It seems more like old France lives on in Canada, and that it is our country, France, which is the new one." Though some YouTubers still make fun of the Quebec accent, perceptions have changed a lot over the past 10 to 20 years as a huge influx of French expats has arrived, particularly to Montreal and Quebec City. Marielle Lumineau and her sister Irena Lumineau relocated from France to Quebec 20 and 16 years ago, respectively, and fell hard for La Belle Province, so much so that they wrote us it, Les Français au Québec, a humorous, light-hearted guide for other expats. The duo have picked up some of the telltale Quebec accent and inflections, and their kids, who range from 7 to 16, are completely Québécois, said Marielle. Younger generations in France, Belgium and Francophone Switzerland have also embraced the accent. What's more, Quebec films have garnered the prestigious César Award at Cannes, and Quebec comedians like Sugar Sammy are in huge demand on French stages. The French language and the sense of pride in the Québécois identity have indeed come a long way. The French language is central to the Quebec identity, said Bouchard. We've made a lot of progress since the 1960s with regard to the presence of French in the public space, French as the common language, the right to work in French, the number of people here who are fluent in French, but things remain very fragile. Indeed, many here still remain self-conscious about the way they speak. But Dominique Chenard, a former French teacher in Montreal and now a curriculum consultant to other French teachers, wants this attitude to end. French is full of idiosyncrasies. Every country in the French-speaking world has its own peculiarities, she said. Some immigrants who come here from France and French-speaking countries like Morocco, who insist that their kids not speak Québécois French, are just being snobs. We have to stop beating ourselves up about it. We need to stop thinking we don't speak proper French.